Good day and welcome to CDI Talks. My name is Anton Shekhovtsov and I chair the Center for Democratic Integrity, an Austria-based NGO that analyzes attempts of authoritarian regimes to influence politics and societies in Europe. Today I'm talking to Slovak political scientist Grigorij Mesežnikov. Grigorij was born in the Soviet Union but moved to Czechoslovakia back in 1981. In the 80s and 90s he worked at the Comenius University and the Slovak Academy of Sciences. In 1997, together with Slovak scholar and future diplomat Martin Butera, Grigorij co-founded the non-governmental think tank Institute for Public Affairs, and since 1999 has been its president. Grigorij is a prolific writer, and in addition to numerous essays for Slovak and international academic journals and mass media, he authored and co-authored several books on Slovak politics and political parties. In recent years, Grigorij Mesežnikov has published a series of insightful works on foreign malign influence in Slovakia and domestic enablers of that influence. As always, I hope you will find the conversation interesting, and if you do, please like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel to stay updated on future episodes of CDI Talks. Grigorij, thank you very much for this opportunity to talk to you. We'll be talking about Slovakia, we'll be focusing on Slovakia, but also talk about the perceptions of the Russia's war against Ukraine and Russia's malign influence in this country. You know, Globsec, if we look at the polls conducted by Globsec in 2021-2022, we will see a slight decrease in the opinions in Slovakia, suggesting that this country should be considered somewhere in between the West and the East in geopolitical and also civilizational terms. Although these opinions, they're still a majority, they still represent a majority, but the situation seems to change and more people in Slovakia say that this country should be part of the West. Could you comment on these changes? Because I think one of the reasons is obviously the invasion, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation. This might have, I think, contributed to these slight changes, but what would you say about that?
Yeah, I agree with you that probably this aggression, Russian aggression against Ukraine affected the perception of the own country of Slovaks, but usually answering to this question, because it's a very frequently asked question. I am answering that unfortunately many Slovaks, they do not know in what country they live, because Slovakia of course is not something in between. Slovakia is an integral part of the West, so we are not speaking about geography. But even if we are speaking about geography, it's not, fully true that Slovakia is something in between. But socially, politically, economically, mentally, confessionally, Slovakia is a part of the West. We have liberal democracy, we have free society of Western style, we have economy which is integrated part of the West. The global economy is a part of the economy of Western world. Slovaks are Western Christians, both Catholics and Protestants. Maybe we are the eastern part of the West, but we are part of the West. I have to say that there are some factors, historical factors, socio-cultural factors, which are really encouraging the persistence of this kind of perception of the country, of the state and society. Because Slovaks, it's a really relatively young nation. The Slovak nation was formed in the second part of 19th century. And many decades Slovaks didn't have their own state. Then, fortunately for Slovaks, they became a part of Czechoslovakia, which was de facto national state of both nations. So it was Czechoslovakia. Of course, Slovaks were in a bit subordinated position because Slovakia was a less developed part of the state, it's clear. But nevertheless, thanks to this episode, very important historic episode, Slovaks became the state-forming, state-creating nation that time. So, and then Slovakia, after collapse of communism, became sovereign state. But still, before it was a part of the so-called socialist camp, which definitely wasn't part of the West in political sense. So that time I maybe wouldn't be surprised that people that time, let's say, considered their own homeland as a something in between, because Slovakia is a part of Czechoslovakia, was a member of Warsaw Treaty. So we were even part of the East de facto. Geopolitically. But today we are geopolitical. I think that today it's absolutely full compliance of the so-called geopolitical position with the internal, as I said, social, cultural, economic, mental even, I would say, and confessional environment. So, but realistically speaking, I think that this approach, this perception of their own country as something in between among Slovaks probably will persist still.
Also, there is a generation, or probably even two generations, that still remember those socialist times, and for them it's very difficult to switch from one perception, a country which is part of the East geopolitically and civilizationally, and then suddenly, just with the accession to NATO and the EU, it was still
right.
It was right. quite fast, all those changes, and you can't. The mentality, you can't simply switch it very quickly.
And I can also refer to the neighboring countries. Among nations of these states, our neighbors, Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, also it's quite considerable part of the population still thinking that their countries are something in between. But in Slovakia there are some specific additional factors. You mentioned these two generations after the collapse of communism, and there are older generations which really they remember how their country, state, Czechoslovakia or Slovakia was a part of the socialist camp. But even in 19th century was quite, say, present in public discourse of Slovakia, the concept of pan-Slavic, maybe brotherhood, solidarity, or belonging to the different part of the world than, let's say, so-called Anglo-Saxons or Romans, so that all Slavic nations, they allegedly they would have, according to this concept, the common destiny, and even closer relations to Russia, for example. One of the most prominent representatives of this way of thinking, Ľudovít Štúr, who is iconic person here in Slovakia. He is really national leader, I would say national hero in terms of his participation and contribution to creation of Slovak nation. He is considered as a codifier of Slovak language, and at the end, and he was say believer in these ideas. Not only him, but at the end of his life, he decided, after being frustrated and disappointed with the unsuccessful efforts of the smaller Slavic nations to establish kind of arrangement, maybe not the full independent state, but kind of federation, maybe under umbrella of Austria, of creation of federation only of Slavic nations. And after all these unsuccessful efforts, he just suggested Slovaks to join Russia, to dissolute in the Russian nation, to accept Russian language as a national language of Slovakia, and even to baptize to the Orthodox Christianity.
It sounds like a real desperation.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I mean, he was the national representatives of liberalizing thinking, but becoming more and more conservative, and especially on the background of these unsuccessful efforts and really not very sensitive policies of both Austrians and Hungarians to Slavic nations. He became admirer of Russian authoritarian, we would say today, regime of monarchy, and proposed this kind of de facto maybe self-killing, cultural and ethnic self-killing of Slovaks. Today reality is completely different. Even those who perceive that their country is something in between, considerable part, maybe even a bigger part of them, for example, they support our membership in the European Union. So it means that it's not clashing to each other. Maybe the percentage of supporters of membership in NATO is a bit lower among these people, because those who consider us as a West, I mean our country, Slovaks, definitely all of them are for membership in the European Union and NATO. But you mentioned the effect of
the war.
Russia war in Ukraine. I would refer to some other public opinion polls which are indicating that really some positive, from my point of view, shifts, which is confirming the abandoning of very naive, maybe idealistic ideas about Russia. Because this war was, especially start of this war, was so brutal that, I mean, these unbearable pictures of suffering people, killed people, destroyed buildings, homes, infrastructure, and it's still continuing. And if before the war the public opinions showed that people somehow ascribed responsibility for the tension before the war, the tension, so this Russian ultimatum and concentration of Russian troops in the border regions and many, so this confrontation, and people still, they saw the West or Ukraine as a responsible, not seeing Russia. So it was a reality. But after this war, I think that percentage of such people decreased. I think that 50%, and the same, the popularity, or I would say level of approval of Putin, if I can use this American phrasing. Putin is not today so popular and so trustworthy as he was before the war. Otherwise, of course, even this 28% is quite big portion. But before the war, it was 50, if I'm not wrong, 54. So, and another positive in this, I mean, it's tragic event, very dramatic, and I mean, it's a catastrophe of global significance. What now Russia started, it's a global catastrophe. But on the level of public opinion in Slovakia, the positive shift is that the support for our membership in the European Union and NATO, and a special perception of the West and especially NATO as a guarantee of our security, really increased. So now we have among the population more consolidated position, and I hope that this process will be continuing, and more not only revelations of Russian crimes, but I mean more informations about what is happening there. And I have to say that Slovak independent media, they are doing very good job in this.
I'm sure that the Russians are also observing these trends and these developments, that there are more people in Slovakia who believe that they're part of the West, that support for Putin's regime is falling. And do you see any then increase in Russian attempts to exercise malign influence in Slovakia since the start of this full-scale invasion of Ukraine?
Absolutely, because it's one of the lines in Russian propaganda, first to persuade people that Russia is fighting for justice in Ukraine, for fixing the injustice from the past. And I mean, they did this when they annexed the Crimea and occupied Donetsk in 2014. But after this war was started by them, definitely they strengthened their activities. I have to say it's very important also to realize that we do not have any Russian media in national language. So there are no Slovak branches of Russian media, but it's an ecosystem, I would say, it's plenty of different platforms, mostly online platforms or chats in social networks, which are de facto, they are retaking the content from Russian media, different Russian media, so federal, so-called mainstream, Russian mainstream media, of course not opposition and not independent, but state media, and these different alternative platforms, and even platforms directly ruled by secret services. And then they are translating these Russian in Russian language reports, news or analysis, all kind of contents, and then they are publishing here in Slovakia, and they are very active. So we have, of course, presence of Russian media seen through this domestic, not offsprings, but domestic.
But they're
outlets.
Domestic actors.
Domestic
they're
actors,
not
yeah.
Russian, influence operations.
Yeah, but they are. Well, we had one case. In one case, it was confirmed that people from Russian embassy, evidently officer of GRU, the person was expelled from Slovakia. He was paying the collaborator of one alternative media outlet here in Slovakia. By the way, this media outlet was closed.
But would you say it's the only media that was directly funded or supported by the Russian state?
They're definitely supported ideologically, I would say. There were some evidences that people who were working for this media, they were paid by Russian embassy, but also I have to say that Russian embassy as such, Russian embassy itself was and still is active on the social network, on the Facebook, and there were all national cases in which Russian embassy was involved.
You mentioned the embassy as one of the main actors of Russian malign influence, but does it create any sort of front organizations, like fake NGOs that would promote or advance Russian foreign policy positions in Slovakia?
Well, I don't know about direct involvement of embassy in creation of such organizations. There are some organizations which are somehow associating, let's say, Russian compatriots, Russian diaspora here, and I know that they work in close cooperation with Russian embassy. It's Union of Russian. Then there is a Russian Slovak society, which is led today by the former Prime Minister Jan Čarnogursky. But both organizations, I think that they were formed years and years ago, and what I also know that in some regional cities there were some organizations which were formed, I think that after 2014, with such names very strange like Молодая гвардия or Rusici or something like this. I don't know whether really only Russian, ethnic Russians are there, let's say Slovak citizens of Russian origin, or maybe Russians, just Russian citizens living here. But there are some other organizations which definitely were not formed directly by Russian embassy, but they are quite active in promotion of Russian narratives. Mostly they are national conservatives, as they label themselves. Some of them are Christian, some of them are quite active and have their political preferences. Some of them supports the right-wing extremists. We have two extremist political formations in the parliament. The first is Old Fascist Party, as I call this party, led by Marian Kotleba, People's Party Our Slovakia. And the second party, splinters from this party in this electoral site, party called Republic. And both of these parties are very pro-Russian. The party leader of Republika, he is a member of European Parliament, and he belongs to the small, tiny group of MEPs who are voting always for Russia. So against all critical resolutions about Russia, Russian aggression, Russian repressions against political opponents. His name is Milan Uhrik. So, but also there are some people engaged in these social organizations with Russian cultural or, I don't know, not political but public inclinations, admirations of Russian culture and so on. They are not inevitably supporters of these extremists. They are among supporters of moderate nationalist parties, Party Smer, which is officially Social Democratic Party. Today they are in opposition. Robert Fico is the leader of this party. He is pro-Russian. And I think that a very small number, if any, of such people who vote for pro-Western pro-Western, center-right parties.
Do you see within these environment, within this pro-Russian, pro-Kremlin environment, do you see any changes considering the military successes of Ukraine on the battlefield? Because there is, I think, this psychological inclination to rather support the winners, the victors, than the losers. So probably even among these pro-Russian forces, maybe there can be change if they see that actually Ukraine is winning the war.
Well, we see in opinion polls some changes in positive direction. The last opinion poll showed that 47% of Slovaks wish Ukrainians to win, and 19% they wish Russia to win. My feeling, and maybe on the basis of my personal empirical experience, is that among these people the share of true believers is very high. So nothing, I think, would change their mind. Nothing would change their mind. They are, I mean, it's a cluster of values which is typical for them. They're against liberal democracy. They're against the West. Russia for them is good because Russia is fighting against this rotten liberal ideology, liberal democracy, rotten West, against America, allegedly dominant America, which allegedly tries to conquer the whole world. So I think that regardless of whether Ukraine, I hope that Ukraine will win or Russia will be successful, they will be always on the side of Russia. Of course, they will be very disappointed and frustrated if Russia will lose. But I think that they are preparing to justify this failure. I mean, and of course, what will be the reason that this West, who is very unjust, who is hostile to Russia, that West use all its potential and use Ukrainians. Now they are speaking that West is prepared to fight to the last Ukrainian. Yeah, so it means that I can imagine, I mean, how they will justify their failure.
Russia is increasingly using now energy policies, energy politics, in order to exert pressure on Europe, on the West in general. How active is Russia in Slovakia with weaponizing energy policies?
Well, Russia unfortunately has favorable conditions for weaponizing its energy policy, specifically in Slovakia, because we are, at least till the last months, we are absolutely dependent on the Russian supplies. Oil, gas, almost 100%, maybe a bit less. We are one of the most dependent country on Russian energy, but there are some positive developments in this. I will tell a bit later, but how Russia is weaponizing. I mean, Russia is simply doing what they think is beneficial for them, and their local agents here is blaming Slovak government for being not enough friendly to Russia and alienating Russia and de facto justifying the Russia's energy. I remember how at the end of the last year, when there were problems with the supplies of Russian gas to Europe, how local Slovak agents of Russian influence published very critical, I would say very hostile comments about policies of Slovak government. The Slovak government doesn't care about its citizens, only cares about common European policies and so on. But the positive shifts took place on the ground. Slovakia and Poland interconnected their gas transportation system. I think it happened 1 month ago, month and a half ago, not very long, but 50 kilometers of this pipeline. So now Slovakia can use the pipeline, Polish pipeline with the gas coming from Norway. And it's win-win, by the way, win-win step, because Poland doesn't have enough storage for their gas, but we have self or half-empty storage of gas on our territory. So Poland can help us to get this gas and also to store this gas on our territory. And another positive shift is that officially the third and fourth block of Mochovce nuclear plant will start to produce electric energy at the end of this year. So the construction was completed, finished. Now it's a process of certification, but definitely since the beginning of next year, Slovakia will produce electricity. It will be good for us, for our neighbors, and maybe even in this situation, even for Ukraine.
I think it's a very good example actually for Germany, which is now closing down its nuclear facilities while Slovakia is opening, and this is a good development in my opinion. But it's not dependent on Russia. This nuclear plant.
It's technologically it was built with the Western technological.
Because in Hungary, this Paks nuclear plant is dependent on the Russians, and this is one of the instruments of Russia's influence in Hungary. So.
Well, I think that so far we all these reactors which worked in Slovakia, built in the previous years, of course they were dependent on Russian supply of this fuel. But I think that these third and fourth blocks of Mochovce nuclear plant was built with Western technology, and I think that these two blocks will not be dependent on Russia.
So you seem to be very positive about these developments. So would you say that Slovakia is doing enough to decrease its energy dependence on Russia?
Well, unfortunately, in the previous years, all governments, regardless of their party composition, underestimated this issue of dependence. It was quite surprising that even pro-Western center-right governments behaved in such, I would say, not very cautious manner. But now I see that the political class, especially, looking to the east, looking what is happening there, analyzing what Russia did since the second half of the last year till now, that Russia is blackmailing, Russia is restricting the flow. I think that Russia is behind of the damage of Nord Stream 2. Of course, I'm not insider, but I think that it's very, very probable that it was Russia. So in this situation, Russia is really a risk for our situation in energy as such. I'm not speaking about only insecurity, but it's possible that if Russia will behave as it did before, then we will be in real danger. So it's also exposed objections and criticism of our previous government, which, as I said, they were declaring necessity to diversify, but they did very little, if any.
But now the change is positive.
Yes, now the change is positive, and new Minister of Economics, good friend of mine, and our former even author of our publications, Karel Hirman, who is expert. He is really excellent expert on energy. He is maybe the most busy member of the government, which is working just on strengthening our position in energy sector.
In what other areas could Slovakia do better in fighting Russian malign influence?
These two areas are very interconnected, but they are very important. It's first education in the schools, and gradual abandoning or leaving the old style, old fashion stereotypes about Slavic brotherhood, about necessity of ethnic background for cooperation, because much more important is cooperation with other nations and states on the basis of universal values like democracy, human rights, freedom, and so on. So the reform of education. And second thing, I think the strengthening the support for democracy as such, for democratic order, for democratic institutions, increasing the level of belief and confidence of the democratic mechanisms, separation of power, because these two lines are absolutely interconnected. They are background of our domestic development and our participation in European integration. And unfortunately, and it's my personal experience, is that public officials, maybe not on the central level, but on the, let's say, middle level or local level, they underestimate this. They think that it's something absolutely evident and doesn't need any special additional efforts, everyday work in convincing people that democracy is the best. And of course, on the background of functional democracy, functional economy, functional public life and prosperous economy, what is happening in Russia would become more and more unacceptable. So people could then compare what we have here and what are the reasons that we live this good life, and why people in Russia, why they are in so desperate position, why Russia cannot develop itself as a normal society, normal state, but inevitably is aggressively attacking either physically, militarily, or propaganda, on the level of propaganda, its neighbors. So I think that these two tasks should be somehow interlinked, and then our success in debunking and neutralizing of Russian propaganda will be higher.
So thank you very much for this conversation, Grigorij.
It was my big pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I wish you successes in your excellent activities.
Thank you, likewise.